Sarah Miller gazed out the kitchen window, watching the early morning sunlight filter through the trees in her backyard. Another day, just like any other. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and idly skimmed through the newspaper. James, her husband, had already left for work, as usual. These quiet moments were rare in their busy lives, but Sarah couldn't help feeling that they were becoming emptier with each passing day. She couldn't remember exactly when it happened, when their marriage had slowly drifted from the passionate, deep connection they'd once had into the dull, routine existence they now shared. They had been married for over 20 years, had 2 children, a comfortable home, and a lifetime of memories together. But lately, Sarah felt as if something was missing, something important. Their marriage, once filled with excitement and affection, had become a series of mundane days blending into each other. The intimate conversations they'd had in the past were now replaced by brief exchanges about everyday matters, bills to pay, appointments to make, chores to complete. There was no longer the spark that once lit up their relationship, no longer those moments of playful touch, stolen glances, or shared laughter. There was just silence. Sarah realized that she and James had become more like roommates than lovers. They coexisted in the same space, each caught up in their own routines, but there was no real emotional connection. James was still the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, but something had changed. She had changed. And in that change, somewhere along the way, they had lost each other. Character introductions. Sarah Miller, a 45-year-old woman, successful in her career and strong in her independence, Sarah had always prided herself on being able to juggle the demands of work, home, and family. As the director of marketing for a large corporation, she was intelligent, organized, and focused. But in her marriage, she had become disconnected from her own needs and desires. She had been so focused on her roles as a wife, mother, and professional that she had neglected her own emotional well-being. Now Sarah was left wondering who she was outside of those roles, and whether she could ever find herself again. James Miller, 47 years old, James is a successful financial professional who, like Sarah, had once been driven by passion and ambition. He loved Sarah deeply but had become increasingly distant over the years. He was practical, always focused on the next goal or the next project, and he had unknowingly let the romance slip away from their relationship. James had a deep affection for Sarah, but he didn't know how to show it anymore. They had fallen into a pattern of routine that left little room for connection. Claire, Sarah's best friend and confidant, Claire was the type of person who lived life with passion and purpose. She had always been an advocate for living authentically, and her own relationship had seen its ups and downs. Claire encouraged Sarah to reconnect with herself and explore new possibilities for her marriage. She was the one who suggested Sarah join a marriage therapy course, believing that it could help her rediscover the connection she had lost with James. Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, a marriage therapist with years of experience, Dr. Johnson had helped countless couples navigate the complexities of their relationships. She was insightful, empathetic, and had a reputation for being able to get to the heart of deep-seated issues. Sarah and James were hesitant at first, but they both realized they needed help to rebuild their relationship. Dr. Johnson would be the guide who helped them find their way back to each other. A moment of clarity. It was during a conversation with Claire one evening that Sarah voiced the feelings she had been suppressing for so long. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if we can fix this. I don't even know where to begin. How do you fix something when it feels like it's been broken for so long?" Claire looked at her with understanding. "You start by admitting that it's broken. And then you do something about it. Don't give up just because it feels too hard. You have to try." "I don't know if I can change this, Claire. I don't even know if I can change myself," Sarah admitted, her eyes welling up with tears. "We've just lost the spark." Claire, ever the optimist, smiled gently. "What if the spark is still there? What if it's just buried under the weight of your daily life? You and James can find it again. You just need to make an effort. There's a marriage therapy course I've heard about. It could help you both reconnect." Sarah hesitated. At first, the idea of marriage therapy felt like a last-ditch effort, a sign that they had failed. But deep down, she knew Claire was right. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. If there was any chance of saving their marriage, she had to take the first step. Taking the first step. The following week, Sarah made the decision to sign up for the marriage therapy course. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that it was time to face the reality of her marriage. James, although initially skeptical, agreed to go with her. They both knew something had to change, but neither of them knew how to fix what had been broken for so long. The first session was uncomfortable. Sarah and James sat across from each other in the therapist's office, unsure of how to start. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of frustration, disappointment, and confusion hanging between them. But Sarah was determined to give it a chance. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. As the session continued, Sarah began to realize how much she had neglected her own needs. She had buried her desires and emotions in the pursuit of being the perfect wife, mother, and professional. She had lost sight of who she was as an individual, and in doing so, she had lost touch with James as well. The weeks that followed the first therapy session felt like a blur to Sarah. She wasn't sure if she was making progress or just going through the motions. Every session with Dr. Johnson seemed like an endless cycle of opening old wounds, only to cover them up again before they could fully heal. Sarah and James had settled into a strange rhythm. They still talked about the basics, work, the kids, household responsibilities, but now there was an undercurrent of something else, something neither of them could articulate. It wasn't quite tension, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was as if they were walking on eggshells, both knowing that something deeper needed to be said, but neither sure how to say it. The therapy sessions, though helpful in some ways, had also revealed a painful truth. The years of neglect, the silent resignation, had created a wall between them. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized how much of herself she had put on hold in order to keep everything else running smoothly. She had been so focused on her roles as a wife, mother, and professional that she had completely forgotten about Sarah the woman. The woman who once had dreams, hopes, and passions outside of being the perfect wife and mother. Facing the mirror. It was during one particular session that Dr. Johnson asked Sarah to look at her own reflection, not just physically, but emotionally. "Sarah," Dr. Johnson said gently, "I want you to think about the woman you were when you first met James. What was she like? What did she want out of life?" Sarah paused, the question catching her off guard. She thought back to her younger self, full of ambition, driven by a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. She had been adventurous, spontaneous, confident in her ability to handle whatever life threw at her. But that version of Sarah seemed so far removed from the woman sitting in the therapist's office now. The ambitious, free-spirited woman had been replaced by someone who felt weighed down by responsibilities, doubts, and fears. Sarah struggled to remember the last time she had done something just for herself, something that made her feel alive. "I think I've lost her," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Johnson nodded. "You haven't lost her, Sarah. She's still there, waiting for you to remember her. But it will take effort, time, and a willingness to be vulnerable, not just with James, but with yourself." It was a simple statement, but it felt like a wake-up call. Sarah had spent so much time trying to fix her marriage, to fix James, that she had forgotten about the most important part, herself. How could she expect to reconnect with James when she hadn't reconnected with her own heart? The hard conversation. That evening, after their therapy session, Sarah sat in the kitchen staring at the dinner table, her mind racing. James was in the living room, as usual, watching TV. She could hear his faint laugh, a sound that once made her feel so connected to him. Now, it felt like a distant echo. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked into the living room and sat down next to him. He glanced at her, surprised by her sudden presence. "James," she began, her voice hesitant at first. "We need to talk." James turned off the TV, sensing the gravity in her tone. "About what?" "I feel like we've been living in two separate worlds," Sarah said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been so focused on everything else, work, the kids, our responsibilities, that I lost sight of who I am, and who we are together." James didn't say anything at first. He seemed to be absorbing her words, unsure of how to respond. "I don't want to keep going like this," Sarah continued. "I don't want to live a life where we're just two people sharing a space. I want us to reconnect, to find that spark again. But I can't do it alone." James looked at her, his expression softening. "I don't know how we got here, Sarah. I don't know how we lost it. But I'm willing to try. For you, for us." The words felt like a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were acknowledging the problem, and more importantly, they were both willing to face it together. The power of small gestures. The next few days were filled with small, tentative changes. James, who had always been too caught up in his work, made a conscious effort to be present. He started coming home a little earlier, helping with dinner, and asking Sarah how her day had gone, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't grand gestures, but it was a shift, and Sarah could feel it. Sarah, for her part, began to focus on herself more. She started taking time in the mornings to do things she enjoyed, reading, listening to music, even taking a walk in the park. She began to reconnect with the parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of her responsibilities. And surprisingly, she felt a little bit of her old self starting to resurface. But even as they made these small changes, there was still a sense of uncertainty hanging between them. They hadn't yet solved all of their problems. The therapy sessions weren't a magic fix, and the cracks in their relationship were still visible. But Sarah was beginning to understand that healing wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, no matter how slow or imperfect it might be. A turning point. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, James reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. It was a simple gesture, but for Sarah, it felt like a moment of reconnection. She looked up at him, surprised by the tenderness in his touch. "I don't have all the answers," James said quietly, "but I want to work on this with you. I don't want to lose us." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she squeezed his hand. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were still miles away from where they needed to be, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were headed in the right direction. The weeks following their breakthrough felt like walking a tightrope. Sarah and James were making progress, but the path ahead was far from easy. Every step felt uncertain, and at times, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were simply pretending to move forward. Despite their best efforts, the old patterns, quiet dinners spent in front of the television, brief exchanges in passing, still lingered. But there was a difference now. There was an understanding between them that change would take time. Sarah had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. They had decided, as part of their therapy, to take a short trip together, just the two of them. No children. No work. It was supposed to be an opportunity to reconnect, to step away from their daily responsibilities and focus on each other. But as they packed their bags that Friday afternoon, Sarah couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her stomach. What if this was just another attempt that would end in disappointment? The weekend away. Their destination was a small bed and breakfast in the countryside, quiet, peaceful, and away from the distractions of daily life. The idea was to take long walks, share conversations over candlelit dinners, and rediscover the things that had once brought them joy. It sounded ideal in theory, but Sarah couldn't ignore the voice in her head that warned her this might not be enough. As they drove out of the city, the scenery changed from gray skyscrapers to lush, green fields, and Sarah felt a flicker of excitement. This was a chance to breathe, to take a step back from the world that had been suffocating her. They arrived in the late afternoon, and the bed and breakfast, with its cozy charm, seemed like the perfect place to escape. James seemed eager, but Sarah was still nervous. She watched him unload their bags from the car, wondering if he felt the same unease that she did. Maybe it was just her, but she felt like the air between them was still thick with unspoken words. She wanted to talk, to open up about everything that had been building inside her for so long, but she was afraid. Afraid that the truth might be too much, afraid that their fragile connection might break. The first night. The evening passed more smoothly than Sarah expected. They had a lovely dinner, simple but intimate. James made her laugh, just like he used to. For a brief moment, it almost felt like the old days. They spoke about their children, about work, and about the future, but the conversation didn't feel forced. There was a warmth between them, a spark that had been absent for so long. After dinner, they sat by the fire, sipping wine and talking about their early years together. Sarah remembered the excitement she felt when they first met, how she had fallen for his quick wit and easy smile. James was still that man, but now, she wondered if he still saw her the way he once did. "Do you remember our first trip together?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. James smiled. "Of course I do. How could I forget? We were so young and carefree." "We didn't have a care in the world," Sarah said with a nostalgic sigh. "It feels like that was a lifetime ago," James replied, his tone turning more serious. "I guess we lost that, huh?" The words hung in the air for a moment. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to dive deeper, but it was clear that James wanted to. "Maybe we didn't lose it," Sarah said, her heart racing. "Maybe we just forgot about it." James looked at her, his eyes softening. I don't want to forget about it. I want us to find it again. For a moment, Sarah believed him. But the doubt that lingered within her made her question whether this was just a fleeting feeling, a temporary illusion. She had hoped for so long that things would go back to normal, but she knew deep down that their marriage, their relationship, could never go back to what it was before. They were two different people now. The challenge wasn't to recreate the past, it was to build something new together. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, feeling both hopeful and uncertain. She dressed quietly and went downstairs to sit on the porch. The cool morning air brushed against her skin, and she watched the mist roll over the fields. The silence was comforting, but also overwhelming. It gave her too much time to think. James joined her a little while later, a cup of coffee in hand. He sat beside her, not saying anything at first. There was something peaceful about the moment, but Sarah knew it wasn't enough. They needed more than just a weekend getaway. They needed to learn how to live in the real world together again, how to find joy and connection in the small moments, not just the occasional escape. I've been thinking, Sarah said, breaking the silence. About us. About what we're doing here. James looked at her, waiting for her to continue. I think this is a good start, she said, her voice steady. But we have to keep going. We can't just hope that one weekend will fix everything. He nodded slowly. I agree. I want to make it work. I'm willing to put in the effort, Sarah. The words felt sincere, but Sarah couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. The effort would take more than just agreeing to try. It would take time, patience, and a lot of work. But as she looked at James, she realized that this was the first time in a long time she truly felt like they were on the same page. The quiet realization. That afternoon, Sarah went for a walk along the dirt path behind the bed and breakfast. She had been here before many years ago, when everything felt lighter and easier. As she walked, she thought about what Dr. Johnson had said in their last session, change takes time. And sometimes, you need to allow yourself to grieve the loss of what you thought your relationship would be. She had been holding on to the idea of their marriage as it had once been, but maybe it was time to let that go. Maybe the future of their marriage wasn't about returning to the past, but about forging something new, something that was theirs, built from the experiences and the love they had now. When she returned to the bed and breakfast, she found James waiting for her by the car. He was leaning against it, a soft smile on his face, as if he had been waiting for her to come to this realization. Ready to go? He asked, his voice full of hope. Sarah smiled back, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. Yeah, I'm ready. Returning from the weekend getaway had left Sarah feeling strangely peaceful, but also aware of how much work lay ahead. The retreat had allowed them to reconnect in ways that felt fresh, but once back in their everyday lives, the distractions of work, family obligations, and old habits quickly threatened to pull them back into their routines. The first few days after returning home were a challenge. James had to dive straight into work, and Sarah had to manage the kids' school schedules, grocery shopping, and all the usual household tasks. But there was something different this time, an undercurrent of intentionality in the way they interacted. It wasn't a perfect shift, but it was a start. A different approach. One evening, after a particularly tiring day, Sarah found herself sitting on the couch with her laptop open, sorting through emails. James was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something that, in the past, he would have never done without being asked. It was small, but it was progress. Sarah couldn't remember the last time James had cooked without her needing to suggest it. In fact, their evenings had often been marked by a silent routine. Sarah would prepare dinner, while James would finish up work, and they would meet in the living room for a quick meal, rarely speaking beyond the necessary updates of the day. Tonight, however, was different. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, and Sarah found herself looking up from her laptop, watching him as he moved around the kitchen. The familiar domesticity of it all felt comforting, but this time, there was a sense of togetherness that hadn't been there before. She watched as James hummed a tune to himself, lost in the rhythm of cooking, and for a moment, it felt like they were two people just enjoying each other's company, not just fulfilling their roles in a marriage. Smells good, Sarah said, setting her laptop aside and walking into the kitchen. James turned with a grin. I think I'm finally getting the hang of this cooking thing. Or maybe it's just that I've been watching cooking shows. Sarah laughed. Who are you, and what have you done with my husband? He gave her a mock glare. Hey, I can surprise you once in a while. They shared a moment of lightness, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of ease between them. It was a small thing, but it was meaningful. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes, it was about the little moments where they could just be themselves with each other again. Finding joy in the everyday. The next few weeks became an exercise in rediscovery. It wasn't easy. Sarah often felt overwhelmed by the demands of work and family, and James's work schedule was still a major source of stress for him. But they began to carve out time for one another in ways that felt authentic. They started with the simple things: shared walks after dinner, the occasional date night, and even watching their favorite shows together on the couch. These moments, though small, began to fill the gaps that had been left empty for so long. And with each shared laugh, each conversation that didn't revolve around logistics, they found themselves reconnecting on a deeper level. One evening, while they were sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, James turned to Sarah with a serious look in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began. "About how we've gotten stuck in this routine. I've been thinking about what we're really missing, and I think it's that we've stopped making time for the things that made us happy. The things that made us fall in love in the first place." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest as she listened to him. "I agree," she said quietly. "We got so caught up in everything else that we forgot how to just be with each other." James nodded. "It's like we've been living parallel lives instead of a shared one." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "But we can fix it, right? We can still rebuild this." James reached over, taking her hand gently. "I believe we can. But it's going to take time. We can't just expect things to be the way they were before. We have to create something new. Something better." The challenge of change. Despite their commitment to each other, Sarah and James both knew that the road to healing would not be without its bumps. Old habits didn't disappear overnight, and the weight of years spent in silence was not something that could be easily shrugged off. But there was a new awareness between them, an understanding that change had to come from both of them, not just one. Sarah began to realize that her own emotional walls had been built up over time. She had closed herself off from James because it had been easier to do so than face the uncertainty of their future together. But now, as they both worked to reconnect, she had to confront those walls and allow herself to be vulnerable again. It was scary, frightening even, but it was necessary if she truly wanted to rebuild their relationship. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Sarah sat down with James in their living room. They were both exhausted, but there was a quiet energy in the room, a shared understanding that they needed to talk. "James," Sarah began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking about everything. I think I've been afraid of failing, of getting my hopes up and having them dashed. But I can't keep living like that. I want to be open to what we're building, even if it's hard." James looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and vulnerability. "I'm afraid too," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to give up on us. I want to try. We both have to try." In that moment, Sarah realized something. They didn't have to have all the answers. They didn't have to fix everything right away. But they had to be willing to try. They had to let go of the idea that their relationship had to be perfect and instead embrace the idea that it could be better, even if it was messy and imperfect. The truth was, they both needed to learn how to love each other again, not just in the big, grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday moments that made up the majority of their lives. Building a new foundation. The weeks passed, and with each day, Sarah and James continued to make small, intentional steps forward. They didn't have all the answers, but they were no longer stuck. They had learned to rediscover the simple joys of being together, and through that, they began to rediscover each other. One Saturday afternoon, they took the kids to the park and then stopped at a cafe for ice cream. As they sat outside, watching the world go by, Sarah felt something inside her shift. This wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And progress was enough. As they laughed with the kids, enjoying the sunshine, Sarah realized that she wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was building something with James, something real, something solid. It wouldn't always be easy, but it would be theirs. The months that followed felt like a series of small victories and setbacks. Sarah and James were working harder than ever to nurture their relationship, but the deeper they went, the more they realized how much emotional baggage they had carried for years. Each breakthrough felt like a glimpse of light, but just as often, they found themselves tripping over the same old fears, doubts, and insecurities. The road to healing was far from smooth. It was early spring when Sarah felt the first real tremor of fear. She had been feeling good about their progress, about the way they had been communicating more openly and spending quality time together. James had been more present, more engaged. But as the days stretched on, Sarah found herself questioning if this was enough. She had hoped that the therapy, the weekend trips, the long conversations would magically fix everything. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they were both simply fooling themselves? A test of trust. It was on one quiet Saturday morning, as they sat together at the kitchen table, that Sarah's fears began to surface. James had been unusually quiet, his brow furrowed as he sifted through a pile of work papers. He had always been the type to bury himself in work when something was bothering him, and Sarah could sense something was off. "James," she said softly, setting down her coffee cup. "Is everything okay?" James looked up, surprised by the question. He opened his mouth to speak but paused, unsure how to express what he had been feeling. "I've just been thinking," he finally said. "About everything. About us." Sarah's heart sank, the familiar knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She hadn't been expecting this. They had been doing so well, hadn't they? "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet but steady, even as her mind raced. James ran a hand through his hair, his gaze avoiding hers for a moment. "I'm scared, Sarah. I'm scared that we're making all these changes, but it won't be enough. What if we're still not enough for each other in the long run?" The words hit Sarah like a blow to the chest. It was as if James had voiced all of her own fears. She had been wondering the same thing. What if, no matter how much they worked on their marriage, it still wasn't enough? What if they had already reached a point of no return? "James," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know if we'll ever be perfect. But I know that we have to try. I know I want to try." James looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I want to try too, but what if we've been pretending? What if we're just clinging to something because we're afraid of what life will look like if we let go?" The vulnerability in his voice took Sarah by surprise. She had always known that James was a practical man, a man who liked to fix problems with logic and reason. But this fear, this raw, unspoken fear, was something different. And in that moment, Sarah realized that they weren't alone in their struggle. She wasn't the only one fighting against her doubts. A moment of vulnerability. The conversation between them stretched on for hours. It wasn't easy. There were tears, there were silences, and there was a lot of painful honesty. They both admitted things they had been hiding from each other for years, the fears, the insecurities, and the ways they had both shut down emotionally in an effort to protect themselves. "I've been so focused on being strong for everyone," Sarah said, wiping away a tear. "For the kids, for you, for my career. But I haven't been strong enough for myself. I've been scared that if I let myself be vulnerable, I'd lose everything." James nodded, his eyes softening. "I know what you mean. I've been scared too. Scared that if I let myself feel too much, I might lose control. I've been so wrapped up in work and fixing things, that I didn't even realize how much I was neglecting you. And I'm sorry for that." The honesty between them was a revelation, like a door being opened to a part of their relationship they had been afraid to confront. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her chest as she realized that the fear they both carried wasn't something they could avoid, it was something they needed to face together. "James," Sarah said quietly, taking his hand, "I'm scared too. But I can't keep living in fear. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We have to face this together, no matter how hard it is." James squeezed her hand, his voice barely a whisper. "We will. We'll face it together." A new kind of love. The next few weeks were difficult, but they were also transformative. Sarah and James knew that they couldn't simply rely on their past routines to fix their marriage. They had to face their fears head-on and build something new together. Every conversation was a step toward healing, every touch a reminder that they were still in this together. They started going to therapy more regularly, not just as a way to fix their marriage, but as a tool to learn how to communicate more effectively. They practiced being vulnerable with each other, sharing their deepest fears and hopes without the walls they had once built around themselves. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She began to express her feelings more freely, not just to James, but to herself. For so long, she had buried her emotions, too afraid to let anyone see the cracks. But now, She realized that she had to embrace those cracks if she wanted to rebuild their relationship. The turning point. One evening, as Sarah and James sat together on the couch after dinner, James turned to her with a quiet expression on his face. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said before, about how we have to try, even if we're scared. And I realize now that you're right. We can't wait for everything to be perfect. We have to make the most of what we have right now." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Exactly. We don't have to have all the answers. But we have to keep moving forward." James nodded, his voice full of resolve. "And I'm with you. We'll face whatever comes together." In that moment, Sarah felt a shift. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a magical moment where everything was suddenly perfect. But it was a turning point, a moment when she realized that they were finally moving past the fear and into something real, something solid. They weren't pretending anymore. They were choosing each other, even in the midst of uncertainty. The road to healing, Sarah had come to realize, wasn't linear. It wasn't something that could be neatly mapped out or completed in a set time frame. It was messy, unpredictable, and at times exhausting. But despite the occasional setbacks, Sarah and James were moving forward. They were trying. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah believed that trying was enough. After their heart-to-heart conversation in the previous chapter, the dynamic between them had shifted. There was a sense of openness between them that hadn't existed before. The walls they had built around their hearts were still there, but the cracks were widening, and through those cracks, a new kind of trust and intimacy was beginning to seep in. But the real test of their progress was about to come. They would have to confront something much deeper than their fears or insecurities, something that would force them to question whether they were truly ready to rebuild their marriage. A new challenge. It was a Thursday afternoon when Sarah received the call. It was from the school, telling her that their youngest daughter, Emma, had fallen during recess and was being sent home early. She had scraped her knee badly, and while it wasn't a major injury, the school felt it was best for Sarah to pick her up. Sarah immediately dropped everything, work, chores, everything. As a mother, she knew that her kids came first, and she headed out the door without hesitation. But as she walked out, she noticed James on a conference call in the living room, speaking in hushed tones, his focus clearly on something else. "James, I'm heading to pick up Emma," she called out, her voice tight with urgency. He barely glanced up. "Okay. Let me know if you need anything." She nodded, but something felt off. There was a coldness in his tone that hadn't been there before. It wasn't unusual for James to be absorbed in work, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She drove to the school, worrying about Emma, but also about the feeling that had settled in her chest. She could sense that something was brewing between her and James, but she wasn't sure what it was. By the time she returned home, Emma was safely tucked in bed, nursing a bandaged knee and a slight headache from the fall. But Sarah's mind was still unsettled. James had retreated into the same routine as before, preoccupied with work, and even though he had asked about Emma, there was a distance between them that she couldn't ignore. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sarah decided to confront the growing unease. The conversation had to happen. The conversation they had to have. "James," Sarah said carefully, putting down her fork, "we need to talk. About what's going on between us." James looked at her, clearly caught off guard. He set his fork down and exhaled slowly, clearly reluctant to engage, but knowing that avoiding it wouldn't make it go away. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense. Sarah took a deep breath. "Lately, it feels like you've been distant. I know you're stressed with work, but you haven't been really here with me. When I left to pick up Emma today, you barely looked up from your phone. You didn't even ask if I needed help. I just feel like you're slipping away again." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I didn't mean to seem distant, Sarah. I'm just trying to keep things together. I've got a lot on my plate, and I guess I've been buried in work. But I'm still here, okay?" "But are you really?" Sarah pressed, her voice softer now. "You've been physically here, yes. But emotionally? It feels like you're checking out again. It's like we're slipping back into the old patterns." James's expression darkened. "I'm not trying to check out, Sarah. It's just, everything feels overwhelming right now. Work, the kids, us, I'm doing the best I can, but I'm afraid I'm not enough." The vulnerability in his words caught Sarah off guard. She hadn't expected to hear him admit that. It was a moment of raw honesty, and it reminded her that they both still had so much to work through. James wasn't the only one who had been carrying heavy emotional baggage. "You're enough," Sarah said, her voice soft yet firm. "But we need to stop pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We can't just keep pushing through and hoping things will magically get better. We need to face this head-on." There was silence between them for a few moments. Sarah could see the conflict in James's eyes. He wanted to be there for her, for their family. He wanted to fix things. But he also didn't know how. Breaking down the walls. The rest of the evening was filled with more conversations, hard, honest, and sometimes painful. Sarah and James found themselves breaking down old walls they hadn't even realized were still standing. They talked about the pressure James had been feeling at work, the exhaustion that came with trying to balance everything, and how both of them had been struggling to truly connect, even as they tried to reconnect. "I've been so focused on keeping everything in place that I forgot to check in with you," James admitted. "I'm sorry. I haven't been present. I've been so afraid of failing that I've ignored what really matters." Sarah reached out, taking his hand. "I know. And I've been scared too. Scared that if we don't fix this soon, we'll fall apart. But I think we're already doing the hard part. We're talking about it. We're trying." James squeezed her hand back. "I don't want to lose us, Sarah. I don't want to go back to what we were before. I'm just scared." "Me too," Sarah confessed. "But I'm not giving up on us. Not now. Not ever." The aftermath. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It cleared the air between them, allowing both of them to acknowledge the pressures they were under and how those pressures had kept them from fully connecting. But even though they had taken a huge step forward in confronting their fears, Sarah knew that the journey was far from over. Over the next few days, James worked hard to make changes. He took more time off from work, not to escape, but to spend time with Sarah and the kids. He began opening up more about his struggles and fears. It wasn't always perfect, there were still moments of tension, and old habits didn't die overnight. But there was a noticeable shift in their relationship. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were learning to thrive. Rebuilding together. By the end of the week, Sarah found herself reflecting on how far they had come. Their marriage wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but there was something beautiful in the imperfections. They were learning how to be there for each other, not just in the easy moments, but in the challenging ones as well. Sarah and James had not only begun to rebuild their marriage, but they had begun to rebuild themselves. They were learning how to love each other without conditions, without fear, and with the understanding that healing takes time. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. It had been several months since the night they had sat down and had one of the most difficult conversations of their marriage. Since then, Sarah and James had made steady progress, though not without challenges. There were still moments of tension, the occasional old habit creeping back in, but they had learned how to communicate, how to be more open with each other, and most importantly, how to stay committed to their growth. It was a Tuesday evening when Sarah realized how far they had come. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The conversation had shifted from the mundane, work and household tasks, to something more meaningful, more vulnerable. And in that moment, Sarah knew that this was no longer just about fixing their marriage, it was about rediscovering who they were as individuals and as a couple. The power of small changes. Sarah had always been a planner, a doer. She liked to have control, to know what was coming next. But as she reflected on their journey, she realized how much she had been relying on external plans and schedules to fix the deeper issues in their marriage. It was only when she allowed herself to be present in the moment, to let go of the need for perfection, that she saw real change. The small changes they had made, James spending more time at home, Sarah making time for herself, were beginning to show results. Their conversations were no longer just about the surface-level things like bills and the kids' schedules. Now they spoke more openly about their dreams, their fears, and the emotional needs they had been neglecting for so long. "James," Sarah said, looking out at the evening sky, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. About how you don't want to lose us. I felt that way too. But I think we're finally starting to build something better, something real." James, sitting beside her, nodded. "I know. It's hard to believe sometimes. But I feel it too. It's not perfect, but it's ours. Sarah smiled, her heart light. I'm proud of us. I'm proud of how far we've come. And I think we're finally starting to understand that it's not about being perfect. It's about being real. The quiet moment between them felt like the calm after a storm. There were no more illusions, no more hiding behind distractions or emotional walls. They had faced their fears, embraced vulnerability, and had learned to trust each other again, facing the future together. As Sarah sat there beside James, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. There was no magic solution to the challenges they had faced, no quick fix. But there was something stronger now, something that had been forged through their struggles. Their relationship was no longer just about surviving, it was about living, growing, and truly being present with each other. Over the next few weeks, they continued to make small, intentional changes. They scheduled more regular date nights, not because it was something they had to do, but because they wanted to. They started taking more walks together in the evenings, just talking, reconnecting. The routine of daily life no longer felt like a burden, but rather a shared experience. And then one afternoon, when they were sitting together on the couch, their hands intertwined, Sarah realized something profound. It wasn't the grand gestures that had brought them back together. It was the quiet moments, the small acts of kindness, the patience they had shown each other when things got tough. I'm not the same person I was when we started this journey, Sarah said quietly, turning to James. And neither are you. But I think we found a new way to love each other. And that feels like the real beginning. James squeezed her hand, his eyes soft with emotion. I agree. It's not about trying to go back to what we were. It's about going forward, together. And I think we're finally doing that. A moment of reflection. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Sarah reflected on the journey they had taken. It had been filled with highs and lows, moments of fear and doubt, but also moments of connection and growth. There was no going back to the way things were, but Sarah didn't want to go back. The past had brought them to this point, but the future was where they would continue to build their life together. It was then that Sarah realized that true healing didn't come from fixing the cracks. It came from embracing them, from learning to live with imperfections and growing stronger because of them. She and James had learned that love was not about perfection, but about choosing each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. And as Sarah sat beside James, their hands still intertwined, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had rediscovered, for the connection they had rebuilt, and for the future that was still ahead of them. A new chapter. The following week, Sarah and James made a decision that felt like the next natural step. They were going to renew their vows. It wasn't something they had planned on doing, but after everything they had been through, it felt right. They wanted to mark this new chapter in their marriage, a chapter that was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the commitment they had made to each other moving forward. Their vow renewal was simple, an intimate ceremony in their backyard, with just a few close friends and family members. There were no grand speeches or elaborate plans. Just Sarah and James, standing before each other, promising to continue choosing love, patience, and growth. As they exchanged vows, Sarah's heart swelled with a deep, quiet joy. She had spent so many years worrying about what they had lost, but now she knew that it wasn't about what they had lost, it was about what they had found. And as James took her hands in his eyes filled with emotion, Sarah felt the weight of all the years of struggle and effort lift away. They had found their way back to each other, not by trying to recreate the past, but by building something new, something real. The ceremony ended with soft smiles and laughter, and as Sarah and James stood together, hand in hand, they knew this was just the beginning of the rest of their journey. A journey where love was not just a feeling, but a choice they made every day. The days that followed their vow renewal were filled with a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from the absence of problems, it was a peace that emerged from the shared understanding that they had worked hard to reach this place. After everything they had gone through, Sarah and James had learned how to truly be present with each other, to give love without expectation, and to rebuild what they had once thought was lost forever. Their marriage was no longer defined by the struggles of the past. They were no longer chasing after the elusive idea of perfection, nor were they trying to recreate a version of their relationship that existed before. They were building something new, something stronger, together. The importance of the little things. Sarah had always been someone who believed that big gestures were the ultimate expression of love. She thought that romance lived in grand moments, extravagant vacations, surprise gifts, and passionate declarations. But as she looked back on the months that had passed since their conversations about fear and vulnerability, she realized that the true foundation of their healing was built on something far simpler: the little things. It was the early mornings when James made her a cup of coffee just the way she liked it. The quiet evenings spent together on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. The hand that reached for hers during a moment of uncertainty. It wasn't grand displays or dramatic changes. It was the quiet, consistent acts of love that filled their lives. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching the sunset from the living room window, Sarah turned to James with a soft smile. "You know," she said, her voice full of warmth, "I never really understood how much the little things mattered. But now, I see it. This, right here, is everything." James looked at her, his expression soft. "I think I've learned that too. It's not about grand gestures. It's about showing up for each other, day in and day out. And we've done that." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She didn't need anything more than this. This quiet, simple life they were building together was everything she had ever wanted, even if she hadn't known it at the time. A family transformed. Their journey had not only brought them closer as a couple, but it had also affected their entire family. The kids had noticed the changes in their parents, the softer tone in their voices, the way Sarah and James took time to be with each other, to show love in the small moments. It was as if the energy in their home had shifted. The laughter, the playfulness, the affection, it all felt different, more genuine. One evening, after dinner, Emma, their youngest, had a question that made Sarah stop and think. "Mom, do you and Dad still love each other?" Emma asked, her big brown eyes curious. Sarah paused, surprised by the question, but then smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. We love each other very much." "But I mean, really love each other, like when you first got married?" Emma pressed, her little voice full of innocence. James, overhearing from the other room, came over and kneeled beside Emma. He smiled, then looked at Sarah before responding. "You know, Emma, the love we have now is even stronger than the love we had when we first got married. It's deeper. It's built on everything we've been through together. And we'll keep loving each other, no matter what happens." Sarah's heart swelled as she watched Emma smile, her question answered, but also her understanding of love deepened in a way that would shape her own relationships in the future. They weren't perfect, and they hadn't been perfect in their marriage, but now, with the lessons they had learned and the healing they had undergone, they were more committed than ever to making their family a place of love, support, and understanding. Looking toward the future. As the months passed, Sarah and James found themselves dreaming again, dreaming about their future, not just as a couple, but as individuals too. There was a newfound sense of freedom in their relationship. They had both grown, and they were excited about what was to come. Sarah had rediscovered her own passions. She took time for herself, pursued her interests, and felt confident in who she was, both inside and outside of her marriage. James, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to be a better husband, he was learning to be a better version of himself, someone who was no longer afraid to show his vulnerability, someone who was open to the messy, beautiful nature of life. Together, they began to make plans for the future, traveling more, building a stronger career for Sarah, and maybe even starting a new adventure. There was a sense of possibility now, something they hadn't felt in a long time. They had spent so many years stuck in routines and fear, but now they were looking forward to life together, embracing each day as it came. A full circle moment. One evening, as Sarah and James walked hand in hand down the same path they had walked so many times before, Sarah looked up at the stars and said, "Do you remember when we thought it was all over? When we were sure that we had lost each other forever?" James stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes filled with warmth and gratitude. "I remember. But I think that was the beginning of something new. We needed to go through the hard times to find our way back to each other. And now, I believe we're stronger than ever." Sarah smiled softly, her heart full. "I think so too. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." As they stood there, together under the stars, Sarah realized that this was the beginning of their new chapter. A chapter that wasn't defined by fear, doubt, or uncertainty, but by love, trust, and the willingness to grow together. It wasn't about waiting for things to be perfect. It was about embracing the imperfections and learning to dance through life together. And as they walked home, hand in hand, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. They had made it through the storm. And now, they were ready for whatever came next.